Last year I sat and passed PACES, and I was one of the first people to sit the new exam, the PACES 23 exam. I've made a full guide here so you can check that out, but today we'll be going over the top 5 resources that I used during my time revising for PACES and what I think of them. We'll be starting with the cheapest ones and then going up to the more expensive, and I hope this guide is useful. So if you're new here, I'm Dan, I'm a junior doctor currently living and working in London, and in my spare time I seem to make YouTube videos. Like I said, I passed PACES last year and I have made a guide, but today we're going to be going over the 5 resources that I found the most useful in my revision for PACES. So the first free resource that we're going to be looking at is the Clinical Skills Pro website, and this thing is so good. I don't know how it's still free. There is a paid version that you can pay for, I don't know what you get with that, but this website is packed full of information. They have a free ebook, but by far the most useful thing that I found in the whole website is this article on what will come up in your PACES exam, and they even have percentages and breakdowns and graphs to show what might come up. I think they've used previous cohorts and asked surveys after people's exams and done a load of research to actually come up with this data, so it is actually fairly accurate, and then they've published it for free, which I think is awesome. Regularly I go back to this table because as much as anything can come up in PACES, I do think it's important to try and hedge your bets. When you're going into your PACES revision, you want to think about the kind of patient that the examiners are going to want to bring into your PACES exam. So they want to bring in a stable patient, a patient that obeys all commands and is actually easy to examine because they're mobile in the bed, and also a patient that has signs that are there and always there, so stable signs. So knowing that, you can come back and look at this list and you'll see that a lot of these pathologies have those features. So do keep coming back to this list, and during my PACES revision I actually kept a log of which patients I'd seen, and I've actually made a Notion template in order for you to keep a log of your patients. I think it's a really helpful tool to not only remember the patients that you've seen, but also it makes sure that you're able to track your revision and you can tick off what you've seen. And if your list for cardiology is absolutely massive, but your list for neurology is, a couple of patients, then you can deduce from that you need to spend a bit more time on neurology. Obviously you need to keep it all confidential, but it's just a really good aid memoir in order for you to keep track of what you've been up to. So the next resource to talk about is the Pre-PACES podcast, and this is an awesome resource and it's completely free. There are now a load of episodes on here. Sam has been working extremely hard, clearly. I know how much time goes into content creation and he must work a lot, especially being a cardiology registrar in his spare time. As I mentioned in my guide to passing PACES, I would listen to this podcast on my way to work. It's a really good way of doing some other mindless tasks like ironing or washing the dishes, and rather than having music, you can just listen to this podcast. I think half the battle with PACES revision is the actual finding the information that you need to know, and actually Sam has done all the curation for you in this podcast, and you just have to listen to it, and that is so helpful and saves you a load of time. I would choose topics that I less commonly saw in my daily clinical practice. I do think the detail is way too much, to be honest, but having that broader understanding of a topic is really helpful. I also found that there were some episodes that would really help me with my strategy to approaching a patient. So for example, before I listened to this podcast, the liver station I wasn't very good at. After those 2 episodes, I had a much better structure for what I was going to be looking out for. When it came to differentials, I had a much better surgical sieve because I'd listened to that podcast, and go check it out, it's completely free. So yeah, thanks Sam. So the next tip I would say is to have an accountability group. I have benefited massively from having an accountability group myself over the last 8 months, and during that time I managed to pass PACES. I found this group so helpful, and at one point in sort of September, all I talked about was PACES and what I was going to do with my PACES revision, and I think it's a really helpful tool that I would highly recommend everyone implement. There's a video here about my whole experience and why I think it's a great tool that does actually work. I was in a group with entrepreneurs who were not setting PACES and didn't know anything about PACES. You don't have to be in a PACES specific group. I think it's a really helpful tool to keep you on track and to look at your life overall and think about where I'm going and what I'm going to do next week. If that is of interest to you, I'm setting up my own free accountability group every single Sunday called Self-Improvement Sundays. It's free to everyone, so it's not going to be a PACES specific group, but I do think it's a really helpful tool in PACES to have an accountability group. So if that's interests you, check in the description down below, and I look forward to seeing you there. So the next thing to talk about are books, and there's a bit of a disclaimer with this because I don't really use books. The one that I did buy was the Cases for PACES book, and to be honest, it's a good book. It has all the cases that may come up in your PACES exam, and actually it goes into all the detail, and I used it more as a resource for information and looking stuff up, or reminding myself of the pathophysiology of a kind of process. I wouldn't sit down and read it. I think some people do, and that's how they learn, but for me that's just not how I learn, so I don't think that's a reflection of the book, but just a reflection of me rather. The next book I was given, I didn't buy, and that was the Pocket PACES book. This is, I found, a useful resource. To be honest, this book you cannot read, I don't think. It's a lot of information, it's a good resource, but again I think it goes into way too much detail. I don't know, I'm not a book person, but that was another book that was on my radar. So if you're enjoying this content, then please do me a massive favor, hit the like button and share this to your PACES group. Colleagues may find some of this information invaluable, and it's really good PACES karma. So please, please, please just hit the share button really quickly for me now. Thanks. So the next thing to talk about is the past test videos, and these start at £160. To be honest, it is expensive, but they are actually really good. I started with this as the first thing that I did for my revision and actually used it throughout my revision. And it's a really good way, if you have just 20 minutes, you can just stick a video on. I mentioned in my guide that during my revision, I was getting up early before work and I would do 2 to 4 of these past test videos. The resource itself is basically a bunch of videos, and most of them are around examining clinical skills, but they do actually have some consultations. So the station 2 and station 5, the new ones. So that was really good. And they also have communication stations. And I think, although I didn't use them that much, I was reassured that I watched a few of them and I was like, I can do this. So if you're struggling or worried about those stations as well, I think those resources are helpful. So each case in the examining clinical systems will be made up of 3 videos. In the first video, the candidate goes and examines the patient. The candidate is immaculate, is unbelievable, and you should not think that that is the standard that you need to pass PACES. That is way above the standard you need. They are really good. They do their best to demonstrate the signs in the video. There is obviously the limitation that you're not examining the patient yourself and it's going through the medium of video. They will add the heart sounds in the audio and also the breath sounds, but again, it's hard sometimes to interpret those sounds and signs. So I would watch the examination video and then I'd pause the video before the next video started, which is the presentation. I'd then give my presentation. So I would say, I've just examined this gentleman, and on inspection on the end of the bed, he had a midline sternostomy scar and notably no harvest scars, and go through the presentation. Obviously, as I've said, there were limitations, so sometimes I wouldn't pick up signs, and actually sometimes that would mean that I had no idea what was going on. But I would still try and do a presentation, and then I'd listen to the exemplar sort of candidate presentation and compare my presentation to that and see if we thought the same thing. Like I said, you do have to be easy on yourself. These candidates are excellent and they're also actually examining the patient, whereas you're watching them through a video, but I think that's a helpful way of learning. And after that, you can pause the video during the 4-minute video when the examiner is asking questions like, what would be your differentials? And then you can pause the video and say what you think the differentials are and go through your cervical sieves, and it gives you an opportunity to practice your presentation skills even though it's just a video at home. I would recommend doing that. I've said in my full guide that doing PACES revision properly, I think, is the key to passing PACES. You have to always do it properly. After that, then you get the examiner's feedback, and that in general is very helpful. I've mentioned already in this video that finding the information that you need to know for PACES is half the battle, and I do think that this resource gives you a lot of that. You'll pick up snippets of knowledge that you need to know for the exam, like tacrolimus gives you a tremor, and from that you can then go and revise those snippets of information because you won't know them from your clinical practice necessarily. So I would definitely buy this resource again if I was sitting PACES, and I think it's worth the money. As I've said, the downsides are that it's limited by the very format that it is, which is videos. I guess the second downside would be that the candidates are incredible, and that can give you a false sense of what you need to be. The caveat to that, I would say, is that you don't want to be learning from lousy candidates. So I think that's why they've put them in, and equally it gives you something to aim for, and if you can be 50% of what those candidates are, I'm pretty sure you'd pass PACES. The second thing, I think it really helps with the exam routine, just watching someone do a cardiovascular exam. I think it's helpful to see that over and over and over again. I think you do get better at interpreting signs through these videos, weirdly. I think the fact that it's like limited means that actually you look out for it more, and then you sort of say, oh, is that clubbing, is that not clubbing? And then you're thinking about the signs that you should be picking up, and then I think that translates into clinical practice. Also, there's some things that you just need to see once. Right at the start of my PACES revision, I had a liver transplant patient, and the consultant told me to go and examine them, and I didn't know what it was. I'd never seen a liver transplant, but after that I could then, recognize the liver transplant scar straight away, obviously. I think these videos give you that exposure so that actually when you're coming to the wards and your PACES practice in person, you may have seen some of these things in the videos before, and it means that you have a vague idea of what you're examining. So you may not still be great at examining patients, but you then get so much more out of that learning experience than if it's the very first time you've ever seen something and you have no idea. So I think those videos are helpful for that as well. And the biggest thing I think is that you can start at home. So I did this right at the start of my revision. I still did it throughout my revision. I found it a really helpful resource, but actually this was a way of getting ahead and building my confidence and not looking like an absolute lemon the first time I turned up to PACES teaching. And I think it's really important to not knock your confidence. This is an exam of confidence. You have to safeguard your confidence, and this is a really good way of doing that. And the next thing to talk about is the Bite PACES course. And this is £500 basically. So this is the course that I took. I'm not going to review any other courses because I haven't took them, but this was the one that was recommended by a friend for me. It's a one-day course and I did it about 2 weeks before my exam. So a lot of courses, especially the ones that are sat in London, are like 4 days and they're really expensive. And I frankly couldn't afford to go on a 4-day course. So this was a weekend, one-day course. And actually in hindsight, I'm really pleased that I chose a one-day course. Knowing that it was a one-day course, wanted to be really prepared and to treat it like a mock. So I booked it a couple of weeks before my exam date. And actually doing that was really helpful. And I don't think you can go to this course and expect to be taught like you probably could more at the 4-day courses. So this isn't sponsored, but it's just an honest review. It is expensive, this course. It's like the cheapest course that's out there because it's only one day, but still 500 quid, so it is expensive. But overall, I think this course is really well ran. It was really well executed. I gained loads from it. And I think the fact that I went into it thinking I've done all the revision and I'm going to test myself in this course, that is the way I'd approach this course again. I think if you're going to be taught, then this isn't the course for you, just in my opinion, because actually you just spend the whole day examining patients in exam conditions. So it was held in Barts, which is like such a nice hospital, and the course had occupied the education centre. There were basically 2 floors, and when we first got there, we were split into 2 groups. We were then asked to partner up, and I was partnered up with this guy called Monty, who I recognised from St George's, but we'd never really met. One group would then go upstairs, and they'd do the 8 rotations up there and go through the 8 stations, and then the second group would go downstairs, they'd do the 8 stations down there. Similar to the exam, there were strict timings. You'd have a couple of minutes outside the station before you go into the room to read the brief. And there was a mix of stations, the old format of consultation stations, so I guess that's the negative. They were still helpful, and then most of it was the examining clinical systems. You're partnered up, and I guess you can do it however you want. Me and Monty decided that we were going to do one each, but we also told each other what we were hoping to get out of the course, and what we were struggling with and what we would like to examine particularly. And if that came up, then I'd do 2 on the trot if they were both neurology and I wanted to do neurology, for example. So like I've said, it was well structured and most of it was examining clinical systems. You'd go in, you'd examine the patient, and then whilst you were starting your presentation, the partner would then examine the patient and just listen to the signs. Then you do your 4-minute presentation, and to be honest, after that there was not that much time, but the examination feedback was really, really good. They gave you a mark scheme. This is very rudimentary, but I think it gives you an idea of whether you passed or failed a station. And I also kept a patient log. I've mentioned that before, and I've made a Notion template down below, but I think it was helpful to then look at that and update your patient log with your mark scheme. So the biggest disappointment of the day was the lunch. So I wouldn't be putting this in. The lead examiner literally said how good the lunch was right at the start of the day, and then it was just like a tray of sandwiches. You know, you're not there for the lunch, but the lunch was disappointing, I would say. During our lunch, we actually went back to one of the rooms and re-listened to someone's heart because we didn't quite hear this like diastolic murmur. And I think that is another point, is that everyone was really flexible, everyone was really keen to get the most out of that one day of learning. Overall, it was a really flexible, nice environment to be learning in. And to be honest, at the end of the day, I was absolutely knackered. So I think I would really have struggled with a 4-day course. For me, I think the 1-day course was brilliant. I think you would need to, you know, go fairly prepared to a 1-day course, in my opinion. And again, loads of information and feedback from this 1-day course. And there you have it. Those are my top 5 resources for PACES and PACES revision. I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, hit me up in the comments. I do reply to comments. And if you found this helpful, then I'm sure that your colleagues may find it helpful as well. And I'd be really grateful if you could share it with them. It's really good PACES karma. It helps out this channel loads, and it gives me feedback that this information is actually useful. So please do that. In the next video, we'll be talking about PACES structure and how to approach your PACES revision. And if you want to have a more entertaining video about how I lost my job or my camper van at Glastonbury, then click these 2 videos here. Thanks. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.